Welcome to Chess Dog. I'm John, and I have to tell you, these days Magnus Carlsen has been in an attacking mood. I mean, he's been really going after his opponent's king, and this game is no exception. This was in the finals of the Julius Baer Generations Cup. His opponent is Arjun Erigaisi. Magnus has white, Arjun has black. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with knight f3, and the opening itself is not particularly interesting. In fact, they get a fairly boring symmetrical position. Not too interesting, but it gets interesting real quick. And they both play this sort of idea of fine ketoing and playing a Slav-type structure. Pretty slow chess at the beginning, c6 and queen to c1. The main move here is knight b to d2, but Magnus plays queen to c1, which looks like a strange move. But he has an interesting idea in mind. Usually, you want to play a pawn break to e4, but Magnus instead is going to angle for the c4 pawn break. The queen at c1 supports that move. Bishop to g4. Arjun wants to trade off this knight, get rid of his light-squared bishop, and then create a barrier on the light squares. Knight b to d2, knight b to d7, h3, kicking the bishop takes, and knight takes. So Magnus has the advantage of the two bishops. That's something, but this particular structure is sort of rigid, and the bishops aren't necessarily that great in a structure like this. We'll see what happens with them. Rook to e8. Arjun angles for the more traditional pawn break, in this case the e-pawn. He wants to play e5 and break in the center that way. c4. Magnus plays a c4 break that we talked about. Queen to b6 puts some pressure on b2, some pressure on d4. Rook to d1 defends d4, and now knight to e4. Now the knight, the rook, and the bishop all prepare the e5 push. Bishop to e3 stops the e5 push because of e5. Pawn takes pawn, and the bishop would be revealed against the queen, and that would just win material. So instead, queen to a6 is played, gets out of the aim of that bishop, and also puts some pressure on c4 and on e2. Knight comes into e5. That helps defend the c4 square. Now knight d to f6. If he takes on e5, then after pawn takes, bishop takes, then taking on d5, you can see white has a good position, and these two pieces in the center of the board are awkwardly placed, to say the least. So knight d to f6 is played. He backs up his knight at e4, but Arjun seems to have given up on the idea of the e5 push. That's the one downside of that knight d to f6 move. And now queen to c2. Magnus puts pressure on e4, and that ties down the f6 knight to the defense of e4 and sort of makes it hard for black to maneuver. So Arjun moves the knight away from e4 and helps apply more pressure to the c4 pawn, and Magnus just pushes it, gains space. The knight jumps in to b5, putting some pressure on d4. I mean, it's sufficiently defended right now. f4. So Magnus is gaining space. He has the two bishops and is becoming more active than black is. a4 gaining some space on the queen side, g4. So now it looks almost like white's attacking on the king side, black on the queen side, but black has very little territory to work with on the queen side. Really, Magnus is getting power on both sides of the board. a3, b3, rook a to d8, centralizing his pieces, rook a to c1, and knight to d7 to challenge this very well-placed knight on e5. The bishop goes back to f2, and in this position, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and white could play e4 to open up the position. This still might have been black's best bet in this game, but instead he plays e6, and now bishop to h4. And it turns out this is a mistake, a small mistake from Magnus. It looks strong. Obviously, he's attacking the rook at d8 and getting in on these dark squares. The problem is this amazing computer idea of g5. And when bishop takes f6, forks the knight and the bishop, and if knight takes d7, pawn takes bishop and the knight returns, you don't lose a piece, but after gf4, black is just better with pressure on these central dark squares, and this is definitely not what Magnus wants. But instead, Arjun plays the move f6 to kick the knight from the e5 square, and now Magnus is still comfortably stronger with the bishops in space. Here, probably b6, beginning to challenge the space advantage on the queen side, was Arjun's best bet, but instead he plays knight to f8. He's sort of hunkering down a little bit. He knows the storm is coming, and he wants to get his pieces in a defensive place. e3, strengthening the center, and then the bishop can go to f1, perhaps put some pressure on this diagonal. The queen steps outside of that potential threat, but also can move back to c7 to offer a defense to the king. Bishop to f1. And the idea here is that the bishop is actually going to go to d3. And there are all kinds of potential sacrifices that can emerge on this g6 square. The knight goes to c7, now g5, and knight to d7. What if he just locks it up with f5? Now there's no kingside play. That's true. But then Magnus would switch to the queen side with an immediate b4. The pawn can't be taken or shouldn't be taken because after rook b1, queen a5, rook b7, and white is penetrating on the queen side. But after the queen moves away, rook to b1, and b5 is still coming, and black would be in big, big trouble on the queen side if that happened. So instead of playing f5, Arjun plays knight to d7 to add some defense to the f6 square. Pawn takes, bishop takes, and then bishops are traded. That was white's bad bishop. But this knight can go into e4, so to stop that, bishop to d3 is played. But also, again, we look at these sacrifices here on g6. White can move the king out of the way, shift the rooks over to the g file, the knight can go to e5, everything aims at g6, and black's king is starting to sweat. Magnus is beginning to mobilize his army for a direct attack. Rook to e7 to defend, king to h2, as we just talked about, rook to f8, and rook to g1. Again, piling up on the g6 square, aiming for the sacrifice. Knight c to e8, rook to g2, planning to double rooks, knight to g7, rook c to g1. Look at that, everything is just ready to pounce. The queen goes to c7. Apparently, the computer said the best move is knight f to e8 to hold that g7 point. White is still clearly better, but that was a move that may have been able to keep black in the game. Queen to c7, and now, boom, bishop takes g6. You get 2 pawns for a piece, but you get a really strong attack after this move. Pawn takes, queen g6, and there are all kinds of threats of queen to h6 and coming into the g7 square. If black plays king to h8, then just queen to h7. And if knight to h7, then knight to e5. The knight comes into g6 and is just forking everything. But after queen to g6, Arjun plays knight to e4. And basically, he wants to keep this knight out of g5. In this position, the knight can go to g5 and threaten mate in different places. So he plays knight to e4 to control that square. And Magnus just plays knight to g5 anyway. He knows he still has an unbelievably strong attack, a winning attack. Knight takes, rook takes g5, and the basic strategy for white is to just play rook to h5, queen to h7 check, and when the king is forced to f7, you just would swoop in and take the knight with check. So rook to f5 was played by Arjun to prevent that, so to trade off that rook so that strategy wouldn't work, but all Magnus has to do is move the rook 1 square back. And now he's still threatening rook to h4, queen to h7, and then taking the knight. The rook goes to f7, but that defends the threat we were just talking about, but it drops the e-pawn. And Arjun resigned because of this continuation. King to f8 to relieve the pin, rook takes g7, queen f5 check, and the piece is regained after rook f7, queen to e6. The game is easily winning for white with the much safer king and the extra pawns. Even after going over this incredible attacking game from Magnus Carlsen, there is still some great chess that you are missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you need to look at is in this video right here. So to make sure to watch that next for some really mind-blowing chess.